You've probably heard the phrase Christ-like thrown around quite a bit,
Oh,
right?
definitely.
Like, usually to describe someone who, I don't know, holds the door open for you at a coffee shop or maybe leaves a slightly larger tip than usual.
Right, like a polite neighbor or something.
Exactly. Over time, the term has basically become this polite synonym for just being a nice, agreeable person. But welcome to the deep dive, because today we're taking you directly into the original historical source texts.
And those are the ancient accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah, and what you're going to find in those texts is that the original definition of Christ-like is, well, it's terrifyingly radical. It's highly disruptive, and it is absolutely nothing like just being nice.
Not at all.
So our mission today is to unpack the core character traits of Jesus from these ancient sources, specifically his holiness, kindness, humility, and obedience, to really decode what it actually meant to walk in his footsteps.
Yeah, and looking at these primary sources is entirely necessary if you want to understand the historical and cultural shockwaves he caused. Because these texts, they don't just hand you a neat list of abstract adjectives.
Right, it's not a textbook.
No, exactly. They plunge you straight into high-definition action. You are reading about a figure who interacts with his environment in ways that systematically dismantle the social, religious, and political machinery of the first century world.
It's so intense.
It really is. The sources build a profile of a person operating with a specific brand of holiness, kindness, humility, and obedience that was just entirely foreign to the culture of his day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start with the most dramatic and honestly perhaps the most unexpected trait found in the sources.
Holiness aspect.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you hear the word holiness,
Yeah.
you probably imagine like someone wearing crisp white robes just sitting quietly in a sterile room so they don't get contaminated by the real world.
Right, a very passive kind of purity.
Exactly, passive. But in these texts, holiness is presented as an active, almost aggressive stance against darkness.
Yeah, it is an invading force. If you look at the accounts in, say, Mark chapter 1 or Luke chapter 4, you see this dynamic immediately. Because the very first beings in the narrative to recognize exactly who Jesus is, they aren't the religious scholars or the political elite.
Right.
It is the dark forces. The texts describe unclean spirits literally crying out in terror, identifying him as the Holy One of God.
Which is wild to think about.
It is, because in the worldview of the ancient Near East, spiritual forces held real territorial power, and they recognized his physical presence as an immediate existential threat to their domain.
I was actually reading through the notes on that encounter in the region of the Gerasenes. And it's just wild. There's this man living among the tombs, completely possessed by what the text calls a legion of demons.
Yeah, a massive, overwhelming force.
Right, this isn't just a guy having a bad day. The locals have tried to bind him with iron chains, and he literally snaps the chains apart. He is screaming night and day, completely untamable. It reads like a...
Like a modern psychological thriller, really.
Exactly, a total horror movie setup.
And you find that specific historical account in both Mark 5 and Luke 8. It is a portrait of absolute localized chaos. But notice the mechanics of the interaction there. Jesus steps out of the boat, and this possessed man runs and falls down before him.
Wow.
Yeah, and Jesus does not negotiate with the darkness. He exercises absolute, unbending authority. He commands the unclean spirits to depart.
And they actually listen.
They do. The text describes them begging to be sent into a nearby herd of swine, which then wildly rushes down a steep cliff into the sea. The darkness is instantly expelled.
So going back to that modern idea of passive purity we talked about, this is the exact opposite. It's not sitting quietly in a corner. It's more like a blinding spotlight suddenly turned on in a roach-infested room.
I like that analogy.
It actively scatters the darkness. But let me push back on this for a second. You're describing someone who's highly disruptive. Doesn't that go against the whole, Prince of Peace narrative? Like, does true holiness have to be this aggressive?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the sources intricately tie Jesus' holiness to his fundamental authority over creation. When these texts call him holy, they are describing a cleansing power, not a defensive posture.
Okay, a cleansing power.
Right. He doesn't just speak suggestions, he commands. When you look at Mark 4, the disciples are caught in a massive, life-threatening storm, and he literally rebukes the wind and the sea, and they obey him.
He tells the weather what to do.
Exactly. And it is the exact same mechanism with the spiritual realm. His holiness disrupts the established order of evil because it carries the ultimate authority of the Creator overriding corruption. It is an active force that ultimately restores sanity.
Because at the end of that Gerasene account, doesn't it say the locals find the guy sitting clothed and in his right mind?
Yes, exactly. The disruption was necessary for the restoration.
I'm struggling to reconcile this a bit, though. Because on one hand, you have this unyielding cosmic authority who commands weather systems and shatters demonic strongholds. But then I'm looking at the notes on his interactions with the sick and the marginalized, and it's a totally different posture.
It's a huge shift, yeah.
He takes all that immense power and just bends it down to the dirt.
And that pivot is exactly what makes the historical profile of Jesus so singular. He wields ultimate authority, but he channels it into unprecedented kindness toward the absolute bottom tier of society. You see the mechanics of this most clearly in how he uses physical touch.
Oh man, the story of the leper completely blew my mind. There's this account where a man entirely covered in leprosy comes up and begs to be healed. And for you listening, you have to understand the first century context here. Leprosy wasn't just a medical diagnosis, right?
Not at all. It was a social and religious death sentence. You were an absolute outcast.
Right.
I mean, the religious law of the era surrounding ritual purity was uncompromising. To touch someone with a skin disease like leprosy meant you instantly became ritually unclean yourself. You were cut off from the temple and the community.
Which is huge.
It was everything. So Jesus, possessing the authority we just discussed, he could have easily spoken a word of healing from 50 feet away just to maintain his own purity status.
Just to play it safe.
Right. But Luke 5 and Mark 1 specifically emphasize the physical action. Jesus extends his hand and touches the man. He touches the untouchable.
Oh, wow.
And for a man who had likely not felt human contact in years, that physical touch is a profoundly subversive expression of compassion. Jesus' holiness isn't contaminated by the leper. His holiness cleanses the leper.
And he applies that same subversive kindness to the social outcasts, too. Like, I remember the passage where he calls a tax collector named Levi to follow him. And he goes to Levi's house for this massive feast. And he's just sitting at the table with all these tax collectors and people labeled as sinners.
Yeah, which caused a huge uproar.
Exactly. The religious elite are furious. They mock him as a friend of tax collectors and sinners.
You find that account in Matthew 9 and Luke 5. And to understand why the Pharisees were so furious, you have to realize that in the ancient Mediterranean world, sharing a meal was an intimate declaration of social equality and fellowship.
It meant you accepted them.
Yes, and tax collectors were essentially local contractors extracting wealth from their own neighbors to fund the oppressive Roman occupation. They were viewed as absolute traitors. So by voluntarily eating with them, Jesus is actively insisting on elevating the outcasts over the comfort and approval of the social elite.
But, I mean, if he's constantly pouring himself out, constantly letting desperate crowds cross his boundaries to touch him or demand his time, doesn't he get exhausted?
Oh, absolutely.
Because in a Roman culture that values strength and dominance, making himself this accessible kind of makes him look weak, doesn't it? I mean, the notes from Mark say the crowds pressed in so hard he couldn't even eat.
The texts are very clear that he experiences profound human exhaustion. In Mark 6 and Matthew 14, he actually attempts to retreat by boat to a deserted place specifically to rest.
He tries to take a break.
He tries. But the crowds see his trajectory and literally run on foot around the lake to intercept him. When he steps out of the boat, his rest is completely ruined. Now, a Roman leader would have ordered the crowd dispersed by force.
Get the guards.
Yeah, but the text states Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He sacrifices his own physical boundaries to heal their sick, and then he miraculously multiplies 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed thousands of hungry people.
That's incredible.
It is. His kindness is never portrayed as mere politeness. It is deeply restorative. He sees the people that the societal machine has completely discarded, and he honors them.
The ultimate example of that has to be the story of the poor widow.
Yeah.
He's sitting near the temple treasury, watching the wealthy make this huge theatrical show of dumping bags of coins into the offering.
Making a big scene of it.
Exactly. And then this widow drops in 2 tiny coins. Statistically, her contribution is completely meaningless. She is invisible to the religious economy. But Jesus stops everything, points her out, and tells his disciples that she gave more than all the wealthy people combined because she gave everything she had.
He sees her when the rest of the world looks right through her.
Exactly.
It is a total reevaluation of human worth, looking past the outward display to the actual posture of the heart. You find that in Mark 12. And, this reevaluation bridges us directly into the greatest paradox documented in these sources, which is the coexistence of supreme power and absolute humility.
Wait, this actually brings up a massive contradiction for me.
Yeah.
Because you just described a guy who commands the weather, expels legions of demons, and generates food out of thin air.
Right.
But then I'm looking at the account in John chapter 13, and this same guy is on his hands and knees washing dirt off people's feet. How do those two extremes exist in the same person?
To understand the gravity of John 13, you really have to look at how the text frames the scene. It is the night before his execution. And the writer explicitly prefaces the action by stating that Jesus knew the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he came from God and was going to God.
So he fully knows who he is.
Exactly. The narrative ensures you understand that Jesus is operating with full cognitive awareness of his supreme universal authority.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because in the ancient Middle East, people walked miles on dusty, animal waste-covered roads in open sandals. Washing the grime off feet was not some ceremonial honor. It was the literal bottom-rung chore assigned to the lowest slave in a household.
The absolute lowest task.
It's basically the equivalent of a Fortune 500 CEO leaving the penthouse, going down to the lobby, and scrubbing the toilets in front of the entire board of directors. Not as a PR stunt, but to permanently alter the psychological framework of the company.
And the disciples' reaction confirms how scandalous this was. Peter physically recoils and tells Jesus he will never wash his feet. It deeply offends Peter's fundamental understanding of hierarchy.
Right, he's like, no way, you are my leader.
Yeah.
But Jesus refuses to back down. He tells Peter that unless he accepts this washing, he basically has no place with him.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to remember they are living under the shadow of the Roman Empire. And in Rome, power was defined by domination. Your status was visually confirmed by how many people you could force to serve you.
Right. The more slaves, the more power.
Exactly. And Jesus takes that entire pyramid of human power and flips it completely upside down. In Mark 10, he tells his disciples that the Gentiles use leadership to dominate. But among them, whoever wants to be great must be a minister, and whoever wants to be first must become the servant of all.
Wow.
Yeah, and he explicitly defines his own mission there, saying, "For the Son of Man has not come so that they would minister to him, but so that he would minister and would give his life as a redemption for many."
I was looking through the notes on the Gospel of John, and it seems like he's constantly talking about being submitted to a higher power, too. Like in John 6:38, the text notes, he came down from heaven not to do his own will, but the will of the one who sent him.
Right, the Father's will.
Yeah, and in John 8, he says he only does what pleases the Father. It's almost like his humility is just a byproduct of him following orders.
So his obedience is absolutely the engine of his humility. He does not grasp at his own power for self-preservation. He is willing to take on the physical posture of a slave and ultimately endure the torture of the cross, purely out of absolute obedience to God's will to redeem humanity.
So what does this all mean? Because if you're listening to this right now, you live in a culture that is utterly obsessed with self-optimization.
That's for sure.
You are constantly told to live your truth, to elevate your brand, to put your own needs first. It is a culture of accumulation. So when you read these sources telling you that this active, fierce holiness, this scandalous compassion, and this radical foot-washing humility is the actual blueprint for life, it feels like a terrible business strategy.
It really does.
How do the sources expect anyone to actually do this?
Well, this raises an important question, and Jesus addresses it directly in the text. After he washes their feet in John 13, he returns to his seat and tells them, "I have given you an example, so that just as I have done for you, so also should you do."
So he expects them to replicate it.
He does. He issues a new commandment. He commands them to love one another exactly as he loved them. He is demanding that radical, self-emptying service become the defining characteristic of his followers.
But the sources don't sugarcoat the cost of this at all. In Luke 9, Jesus tells the crowd that anyone who wants to follow him must deny himself and take up his cross every day.
Which was a terrifying statement back then.
Yeah, because we use that phrase so lightly today, like, oh, dealing with a bad boss is my cross to bear. But to a first-century listener, the cross was a horrific execution device.
It meant tortuous death.
He is telling them they have to march toward the death of their own ego. He says whoever tries to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for his sake will save it. That is a tough pill to swallow.
It is the ultimate subversion of self-preservation. And if you are wondering if ordinary humans can actually operate this way, the sources provide a documentary record in the book of Acts.
Right, the aftermath.
Exactly. Jesus tells them they will receive power from the Holy Spirit, and in Acts chapter 4, you see the result. The early followers are filled with the Spirit, and the theories become reality.
And the transformation in Acts 4 is just incredible, because the same people who were previously arguing about who was the greatest are suddenly living with one heart and one soul.
A complete 180.
Right. They are speaking with immense confidence, pushing back against the corrupt authorities, basically displaying that active, disruptive holiness we talked about earlier.
Yes, and their compassion is just as intense.
Yeah, the text says they shared all their possessions so that not a single person among them was in need. They literally adopted the foot-washing, self-emptying love they had witnessed.
They constructed a countercultural community based entirely on service rather than domination. True Christ-like leadership, according to these ancient texts, requires looking at your own sphere of influence.
Like your office, your family, your neighborhood.
Exactly. And asking how you can become the servant of all. It requires a total reorientation away from accumulating power and toward pouring yourself out for others.
It is a dynamic, incredibly challenging tension to hold. Based on the primary sources, being Christ-like means possessing a fierce, active holiness that stands as a blinding light against corruption.
Right.
It means having a tender, restorative compassion that deliberately reaches out to the people society has labeled untouchable. And it requires a radical, unyielding humility that chooses the lowest place, driven by complete obedience to God. It is light years beyond just having good manners.
It really represents a completely different paradigm for what it means to be human.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final, mind-bending detail from the text to ponder. We've spent this entire time analyzing the staggering, world-altering actions of Jesus. But in John chapter 14, verse 12, Jesus makes a completely unexpected promise.
He really does.
He says, "Amen, amen, I say to you, whoever believes in me shall also do the works that I do, and greater things than these shall he do, because I go to the Father."
Which completely shatters any assumption that his life was meant to be some unattainable anomaly. He establishes his radical actions as the baseline.
Exactly. So here is the challenge for you. If everything we discussed today, shattering darkness with active holiness, loving the marginalized with scandalous compassion, and serving others with a humility that upends social hierarchies, if all of that is just the starting point, what does it mean for you today that the ultimate expectation of walking in his footsteps is to accomplish even greater things?
That's a lot to think about.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical character of Jesus. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.